please just go out the door there and worry about. We're really pleased to have you here tonight. Thank you for joining us for the talk. I won't really delay you any further, just to say that afterwards there will be a chance to browse more, chat next door, have another drink, and you can buy the book with us 30% tonight, or indeed any other way as well. And I refer to the person who's here at Cambridge University Press. So I'm introducing Catherine on behalf of Rachel, who's on the call, but unfortunately our budget didn't stretch to her flying over from New York. Catherine Boone is Professor of Comparative Politics at LSE. This is her book with Cambridge, and we're just absolutely delighted. Will really shake up the political science literature of Africa. While a lot of scholarship has emphasized the role that ethnicity plays in Africa, Boone argues instead that territory really shapes local and national political dynamics in the region more strongly. Bringing together electoral and economic geography, her book offers a powerful new map of political competition on the African continent, while also drawing connections to other countries in the global south and around the world. So it's a must-read of scholars for comparative politics and political science. And I'm delighted to hand over to Catherine now, who has some slides prepared.
Well, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And I really want to thank you all for coming. I know it's after hours, and I really appreciate it. I want to thank Cambridge Bookshop, selling books since 1581 at this site. So I thought that sounds pretty good. And I want to say also, I've never done a book launch before. So, I also figured I should probably do it because it's probably going to be my last book. So, yes, thank you for coming. The book appears in a series called Cambridge Studies in Comparative Politics. So it's really very much a book in political science in that sense. But my real home is African studies and African politics. And so what I wanted to do in this project was to kind of turn the political science analysis more toward issues at the national level that I think have been strongly neglected in the field of political science. But I think the result is something that pulls together much reasoning and research across different disciplines, and does, as the blurb of the book, tries to promise, does kind of create a different way of viewing national level politics. So that's what I have tried to do. So I do have some slides here, and I don't know if you'll be able to see them very well. And I'm also, I should say before I start, I'm going to try to be brief so that we end sooner. So, I think you can't see this very well, but this slide kind of sketches out. This one, sorry, it's advancing by itself. I have to pause. Yeah, pause. That really accelerates things. So, yeah, so here is the problem and the argument on the first slide. So the problem is, I think, in political science, or much of political science, maybe especially Anglophone political science from the US, is that there's been a way of studying African politics for about 20 years that has really directed our attention away from the national level. I think the result in this field has been, and I think it's a problem because this is the vocation of the field, the result has been that the drivers of political competition at the national level are very poorly understood. And the kinds of ways in which politicians connect their constituencies and are accountable to their constituencies is very poorly understood. And what has filled the vacuum in political science has been these theories of ethnicity, as this slide indicates, that political scientists have often, or many have tended, especially, let's say, the Anglophone political scientists, especially in the United States, which is my country, tended to fall into the habit of pointing to ethnicity and ethnic diversity to explain much about politics. So one of the things that I tried to do in this book is to flesh out the argument that this focus on ethnicity is misleading. It's not that there's no ethnicity, and I'll try to touch on it a little bit, but I think the ethnicity kinds of explanations feed a sort of African exceptionalism and feed a sort of habit to turn away from real politics, paradoxically, in understanding African politics, and turn toward more cultural or other more cultural type reasoning. So what I do here instead is to turn to theories of uneven development and try to analyze the underlying economic geography of countries to make an argument about how uneven development and the dynamics of even development can really tell us a lot about political competition and cleavage, or the societal divisions and the way they get politicized within African countries. The main argument, as the subtitle of the book signals, is that regional economic inequalities, and by this I mean basically kind of provincial level divisions, regional economic inequalities go far in driving the kind of competition that we see. So in sort of the language of comparative politics, that's regionalism. The regionalism prevails. And the reason I sort of like this argument, even though, of course, it doesn't explain everything, but it offers a way to connect the economic structure to the political structure, sort of layering or mapping these onto each other in a way that gives you a vision of politics over, I mean, a historian wouldn't call it longue durée, but over, let's say, 100 or 150 years. So a big kind of macro view of the structure of cleavage and competition within a country. So if the unit of analysis is a country like Nigeria or Ghana, then this kind of perspective also allows you a way of comparing across countries over time. So it's kind of large and macroscopic in that way. And then if I could just, since we're in a bookstore, I think this is maybe what offers us some possibilities in teaching using this book, even though it's not really targeted at students per se, but it kind of gives a map or a template of the structure of politics in African countries that's comparative and over time. And I think people will find a lot of nuance that they need to add and layer in, but I think it is a starting point. So the implications helps to explain, I think, the regional political tensions that arise around growth strategies. So at the national level, this kind of approach helps us to scale up and talk about, you know, divisions within countries about different kinds of sectoral diversification strategies and investment priorities, and these kinds of big national level questions that have tended to drop out of the analysis in the literature. Coalition strategies in national politics, I'll show you what I mean by that. And then finally, the last line on this slide is, you know, it takes this literature that focuses on ethnicity and clientelism and doesn't say that this doesn't exist, but puts it in, replace or situates it within this larger spatial and temporal frame. So this is the outline of the talk. Don't worry, or I'm not going to dwell at length on, you see it advances itself. I'm not going to dwell at length on any of these points, but I just want to move to this first point, inequality. The first word in the title is inequality and political cleavage. Is very briefly say what is the inequality we're talking about. The second point is just to show leveraging of the argument from political science, and actually all the main lines of argument just come straight from comparative politics, which is another thing that has been interesting for me, because I think that like a broader theories of comparative politics actually go far in mapping on, as it were, to the African realities. Talk about political science in part 3, and then just very briefly the evidence. These points under the evidence just give you a sense of what the contents actually are, what the chapters talk about, and then finally touch on implications. And please do, I know we're trying to be brief, but please do stop me if you would like to. So this So another thing that I wanted to do in the book was to try to use descriptive statistics use statistics to describe in a way that would help zoom out and make a foundation for a cross-national study. So the only thing I would like to point out about this slide is just maybe briefly refer to this image on the right. So these lines represent world regions from 1980 to 2010. And so this black line is the OECD countries. So this is just supposed to be about the Gini coefficient, which is an index of interpersonal income inequality within countries. And the only point to make right here really is that this red line is the Latin American countries from 1980 to 2010. So everybody knows, sorry, the blue line is the Latin American countries. Everybody knows Latin American countries are super unequal by this measure. So the surprising thing, or the tee-off point for this book, is that this red line is the African countries. So African countries are super unequal in terms of income inequality by this very standard and generic measure. So that's interesting because for a long time, I think a lot of scholars sort of had this idea that interpersonal income inequality in African countries was low because they're, poor countries, and the landholding structure was less hierarchical than in other developing predominantly agrarian countries. So it's a super high. So that's the first part of the inequality in the title. But the second part, and the way this came out, I know you can't see this, but what this is that these blue dots are African countries, and the orange diamonds are other countries. And this is that same Gini you saw on the other slide. So countries are scaled in terms of their interpersonal income inequality, but this was something that, we used in the analysis. This is a measure of inequality across provinces or regions. And the main point of this slide, so this is the UK, and the UK is supposed to be very high spatial inequality, between the London and so the UK is here, and Spain. So in comparative politics, there's vast literature on inequalities within Spain and all the political problems created by, cooperation, et cetera, created by regional or provincial income inequality in Spain is here. So the only point of this slide is all these blue dots are African countries. So spatial inequality across regions is super high in most African countries by world standards. So then we can ask, we have this really high income inequality, that red line, and we have this like very high spatial inequality. So surely we should be, or perhaps not surely, but hypothesis is that there should be political effects that we will see some way in one way or another. So there's a very large literature in African studies that says that class inequality or interpersonal income inequality does not predict political cleavage, although I think that can be nuanced, and I do think it's changing. So, but this book says, well, that may have been so for, a long time, maybe largely the case, but there's a spatial inequality, and the spatial inequality is where so much of the action is in terms of politics. And there's more theory in comparative, again, on other parts of the world that says, in countries like Spain, and the US is around here somewhere, countries where the institutional template of government, of representation and administration sort of tracks these spatial divisions, that tends to bring regional inequality into the political arena. So if representation is by province, let's say, and the provinces are super unequal, provincial inequality is going to show up in politics. And so a big part of the argument, and indeed the empirical part, was to make this argument that in African countries, these kinds of territorial inequalities are underlie the institutional template of government, of representation and administration, and that this brings territorial inequalities to the fore in politics. I have so that this is also kind of boring, although in political science, we love the 2x2. So I have to put this here, but this is just to say, if we have spatial inequality, it can be high or low. Here's low, here's high. We have high spatial inequality and strongly territorial institutions. But most African countries fit in that cell of this 2x2, high spatial inequality and strongly territorial institutions. And I have 12 countries in this study that are, kind of provide the case study basis. And most of them do indeed fit in this cell, although there is a little bit of variation that I try to exploit. But I was in China last month, and I taught those audiences led me to point out that spatial inequality is also really high in China, between the coastal provinces and the interior. But in China, the institutions are super centralized. So it kind of mitigates or attenuates some of the territorial tensions. But the argument here is that most African countries are up in this cell. This Kenya is maybe archetypical, and that produces regionalism or brings regional tensions to the fore in politics. Whoops. I'm going backwards now. Seems to have reversed itself. Yeah, so. Oh, upside down. That's why. I can't do it without my glasses. Yeah. This slide is just about theory and comparative. So theory and comparative says, under these conditions, what we should expect to see is core periphery tensions across regions. Yes, urban, rural. One of the hypotheses that emerges from comparative politics literature on regionalism is that just hypothetically, as a default, we might expect the economically leading region to be the politically leading region. Of course, it's not always true, but you can kind of see why that would often be the case, a sort of hypothesis. And other hypotheses from comparative, and actually I pulled a lot of this out of the literature from American political development, especially the work of Richard Bensel, is that when we have regionalism at the national level, we would expect to see it manifest in canonical policy areas like tension over sectoral policy, tension over national market integration, of course, state design, the distribution of power across units, and redistribution. And so this is just to say, this is kind of teeing off from this literature. I found much evidence of all of these expected kinds of regionalism within African countries. Now so turning to the evidence part. So there's so my friend Bill Hurst told me this is the best part of this book, which hopefully means the other parts are also okay as well. But this one, just kind of looks at the formation of national political economies in the colonial period, and says that, if we take the origin of the states that we have now as we know them, as territorial units, as defined by colonialism, we look at patterns of economic development under colonialism, and especially this uneven integration into the world economy or uneven development, with the export producing regions of the African colonies under European colonial rule being the leading economic regions, the export producing regions, and with state building happening under colonialism around that. So part of the argument that I try to layer in is that it's perhaps obvious to anybody who ever thought about it, is that the territorial grid of the colonial states inframes or overlays this kind of regional differentiation that happened under colonialism. So the colonial power is defined at the provincial level. Let's say for Ghana, Gareth Austin, professor, can correct me, but cocoa producing regions, northern pastoral regions that were conceptualized as labor sending regions, et cetera. So regions, sort of the economic differentiation overlaid by this institutional frame. So that's how we get the coincidence of uneven economic development and the state's territorial grid. So then much of the weight of the argument rests from that point in sort of this point that the institutional grid persists over time from the, post-World War II period through more or less through the present. The institutional grid persists. And also this kind of the leading place in national economies of these export sectors, and indeed usually the same ones, also persist. So this economic geography territorial template, this political economy grid tends to persist over time. Then, going forward, I will make the argument that especially party politics, but the kinds of regionalism that we see in politics today sort of follows these lines. So it follows these lines. Yeah, sorry. To make the argument about persistence, this is the point I just made, that the territorial grid tends to persist. And during the nationalist period, the 1950s, when political parties began to form and compete for control over the state, the largest and most cohesive political parties tended to emerge in the export producing regions. So the wealthiest, best connected, strongest regions were the regions where the most cohesive parties formed. So these tended to be the parties in most countries that were able to seize control of the post-colonial state, sometimes in opposition to rivals that also coalesced in other favored regions during that period. So this era of formation of party systems tends to set the template. And there's another. So this is the slide I wanted to show you. So we do, with my colleague at LSE in economic history, a boundary persistence analysis, just to kind of get to this idea about the persistence of the territorial template. And so this was work that Lee did with our PhD student, Jennifer Kohler at LSE, and it just takes the institutional grid in Ghana and Nigeria circa 1948, and then overlays in blue the institutional grid of today. And so the main point is just that the grids persist over time. Of course, there are some changes, but much of the changing happens with the subdivision of units, and the units are usually subdivided along pre-existing lines. So the territorial template is really strikingly persistent, and the electoral constituencies also follow these lines. So most electoral constituencies emerge out of the former native authorities. The native authorities become electoral constituencies. Sometimes they subdivide, over the decades, but those subdivisions usually follow the lines of subdivisions within the native authorities. So that was one of the most interesting things. So fast forward, and I will try to be the brief. Oops, I keep forgetting to pause it. We have this argument that party systems formed in the 50s and 60s tend to persist along within these territorial grids that also persist. So the way we tried to bring this argument into the present was to use electoral geography to track patterns of voting in 12 countries that have had competitive. They had them, let's say in the 60s or some into the 70s, but the competitive elections resume in the 1990s. So we take this electoral data at the constituency level and analyze voting to see if we see these leading regions sort of coalescing and being the seat of the dominant parties, and see where other, we see if regionalism shows up in electoral politics. So not having any quantitative skills myself, I have my co-author pictured here, Juliette Crespin-Boucaud. She's an economist now. She was from the Paris School of Economics. So we did this electoral geography analysis looking at clusters, regional voting clusters. And indeed, we found them. I'll show you in a minute. And then when we got the clusters, we said, well, what are the characteristics of the places these clusters form? Are they forming in the export producing regions? Are these the leading regions? we found our hypothesis was that they were multi-ethnic, and they are multi-ethnic. We asked if they form within the grid of the administrative template of the state, of regions. We found they do form within the administrative template. And we asked if they still have the production profiles of the 40s and 50s, of the, are they still doing and producing the same thing? And we found that most are. So I know that sounds kind of corny. And so we try to be a little more nuanced in the book, but anyway, that's so basically the thrust of the argument. So this slide, just out of the 12 countries, this is 8 of them. We used countries that have had elections since the early 1990s of differing quality, indeed. And these blue blobs on these maps, so here's Uganda, here is Cote d'Ivoire, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia. Ghana is here, and Kenya is here. So the blue blobs are the electoral clusters that emerge from the spatial analysis. And the different colors of blue don't mean it's more or less, it just look better with the different shades of blue. So what you see is that these spatial clustering happens in some parts of the countries, but not others. So some of this is just very obvious. So in Kenya, for example, in the wealthier, settled agricultural regions, that's where we see the voting bloc clusters. And, much of the country, there's no patterned voting. These are persistent clusters that, aggregate the data over 5 or 6 elections and tend to be the core of what's all the constituencies always voting together at very high vote shares, like 70% or more over time. So for Ghana, actually, this is exactly what anybody who knew anything about the politics in Ghana would expect to see. I think you all can correct me. But anyway, so we find these clusters and we analyze their attributes and we find out basically what this describes. So there's 36 blocks over the 12 countries. So most of them are in the advantaged areas. Most overlap with the colonial era export regions, retaining these specializations into the 2000s. This was very interesting, the block rankings. So in a country with blocks, the leading, the secondary, the tertiary block, these block rankings are very stable since the beginning of the 1990s. The top one tends to remain the top one. Most coalesce within the provinces, and they're multi-ethnic. So we try, for the political science audience, we really drill down on this thing about ethnicity. So it's not just a bunch of, the ethnic groups all voting together, although, the ethnicity is in there, but most of the blocks actually the constituencies are quite heterogeneous in terms of their ethnic identity. So the national patterns, the richest blocks usually rule. They're usually in power most of the time, exactly as we would expect, with a few exceptions. Uganda and Tanzania, which we can talk about. Uganda, country where the ruling party came to power through guerrilla struggle. That's, this kind of fits together if you think about it. So national winning coalition is also something super interesting in political science. So what we find is the electoral blocks that win very rarely coalesce with another, like you don't see the dark blue and the light blue together. It's usually the winning block with those non-block, the white areas, the non-shaded constituencies. So there's a dominant block, and then they pick up the other constituencies that are not, sort of locked into a party or a voting pattern. So the argument here would be, this is where you get this kind of electoral clientelism that is so accentuated in the political science literature, in the relations with kind of opportunistic grabbing of allies. But the blocks tend to cohere and to not to align with the other blocks. So it kind of reproduces regionalism. The opposition parties emerge in economically favored regions. So they're not popping up out of nowhere in very poor and remote regions. You'll have sort of a secondary producer region, and that will be where the the blocks form. And then there's a chapter that analyzes kind of the issues, like what, and this one is kind of just more culled from the secondary literature, but what issues emerge in politics that divide blocks. And indeed, these are, I argue that these are the ones that we would predict from comparative politics, redistribution, state design, national market integration, sectoral policy. So part of the idea here is to say, this is what we would expect from high spatial inequality with strongly territorial institutions. Yeah, this is just a way of display, and whoops, I'm going to skip that. Let's just go on. I'll turn off the, so conclusion. So this uneven economic development can give rise to regional cleavages, entrench them. And this is off in the cases that we have, this is more or less what we see. Of course, there are nuances. So there is indeed a large literature in political science about civil war and secessionism emerging along these kinds of lines. So the basic argument here is that that is true. And this is also much of what we can understand about politics as usual. It's not only war, the conflict cases. This is politics as usual. And indeed, most countries that have politics as usual also have conflict from time to time, like Nigeria and indeed Sudan. And then just, this is the last slide. So Lipset and Roken, so two political scientists who wrote a lot about regionalism, said that this territorial politics was about the economics of nation building. And I think that is a lot of what is going on here, or a way to understand it. So just applied to the issues and the politics. So this kind of helps to anticipate or explain or make hypotheses about the kinds of cleavages that will emerge over growth policy. Like, should we favor the leading regions already, or should we be more distributive and channel resources to the lagging regions? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but I think we see this in a lot of national contexts. And in this sense, this kind of regional competition will indeed shape the character of growth policy. The growth policy will emerge out of this. But another thing that we can sort of pick up in the case studies is that the regional competition also affects the sustainability of policy, because sometimes when you do get electoral turnover, there will be a kind of predictably, a reorientation of growth policy, maybe in its particulars, toward different regional bases, so that we can predict. But then, and this is really the final point, so this theory of regionalism, the thing that I like about it, even though obviously it's too blunt of an instrument to it will miss many things, but I think it helps to bring us back to this idea of the countries as countries having political, shaped by uneven development, with political economies that do have a very uneven productive structure. And we can sort of link material interests to sectors and livelihoods and different producer regions in a way that aggregates up, that helps us to make sense of national politics. And that is the main point of the book. And then I have this slide. This is, of course, this list of thanks could be much longer than it is, but that's just a thank you. Thank you all for coming. So I think we planned that there would just be a brief Q&A, right? Because I know that probably people want to go buy a lot of books and the Cambridge book stuff.
30% discount tonight.
Yes, it is a discount. Yeah. I promise I won't keep you here forever. If there are a few questions, we can continue the Q&A here. Yeah, thanks.
One thing you put in place clientist implications of all unions criticize them to a social contract. Social contract is a useful concept. Does it fit into your framework?
Yeah, I do. I love that piece in the New Left Review, right? The social contract. Yes, I like that very much because it does tap into many of these things that come up here. So what is a producer region that, like, what is a cocoa producing region that can explain why often or in many regards it can appear to have a sort of coherent regional interests in national politics. And so here, their social contracts or links across people and communities and up the social hierarchy and to political leaders around land tenure relations, around a stable reproduction of a certain economic structure. I mean, in the year on year, around prices and credit, and around, preserving and reproducing the conditions that sustain the prosperity of that economy. So I would say that's kind of what I was trying to allude to in the first slide about the kind of accountability that can emerge and provide the cohesion or glue even for political parties that persist over many decades, even if the party's name changes, which throws off a lot of analysis in political science because they think, oh, the party structure is chaotic, it's fluid, it has no. But if you forget about the name and just look at a regional bloc that keeps voting together over time, so you go to the social base, you see these persistent electoral clusters. Yeah, so I think the social contract is yes, a much more fulsome concept for this kind of thin political economy that is invoked in this kind of analysis. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the continuity. Interesting. I'm thinking about sort of moments of rupture. There those factor in. There are moments of socialist government or the national grid is completely reconfigured in different ways. You see things sort of shifting off and then returning to right out here, or are there times when sort of some kind of rupture takes place that throws things in it?
So I think that's a good question because the argument is very structural. So, and the way it's set up so the basic way is set, like the main intuition would be if the structure of if the economic geography changes, we would expect political change, but that would be kind of presumably rather gradual over time. So here, one point that can be invoked is this idea that the extent of structural transformation of African economies since the 1960s has been limited. It's not zero, of course, but it's low. They didn't industrialize and transform completely. They still have these primary product exporting sectors. And then a lot of the structural transformation that is also this hyper-urbanization. So one of the things that we see is that there's super competitive politics in the cities, but in this analysis, these are they're non-block area, they're not cohesive blocks. And in terms of electoral politics, most of the politicians are leaning almost exclusively on rural constituencies. So you kind of have this drag in the political sphere, as I don't know if it's exactly the right word, but sort of anchored in this part of the economy. So then the other thing is a change of the grid, but in these countries, the grid, the biggest change in the grid that we see is in South Africa in 1994. And, they did indeed, change up the territorial grid, but this is the country in which territorial politics is the least salient, even though there are some regional politics within South Africa, least salient in that setting. The other change we see, like in Uganda, is So Uganda is super interesting because there are many anomalies. So in terms of spatial disparity, regional economic disparity, the regional economic disparities are the highest in Uganda of all the countries that we looked at. So that Uganda region alone is by far and away completely off the scale in terms of how economically developed it is compared to the rest of the country, sort of writ large, including, you know, the whole coffee, lower cotton. But the thing that is also unexpected, or, you know, default theory wouldn't predict it, that Buganda region has never ruled in Uganda. They never succeeded in capturing power. So what we would expect, though, then is that there would be a lot of turbulence, and, you know, like in this is not a good equilibrium there because the power is not residing where the wealth is residing. And then, you know, we have Museveni sweeping up from, you know, the remote rural periphery and taking over the center. But even after all these years of Museveni in power, however long, 40 years it's been, still that Buganda region is by far the wealthiest. And so that's a kind of rupture. And you know, one thing that another interesting thing is in Cote d'Ivoire, and maybe this gets more to your point, the richest primary product producing region, cocoa and coffee producing region, was the southeast, which dominated in politics. But the cocoa frontier moved to the southwest. And, you know, this is, I don't mean to say it's a mechanical process, but I just want to say it, in this case, it can be summarized in pretty mechanical terms because political power shifts to the southwest and the southeast declines. And indeed, those people from the southwest capture control of the government. And there's, you know, a lot of, so this, like a very structural theory would predict that you would have a kind of conflict as the center of economic gravity shifts in the country. And you do see that. And, you know, I think people who know Ivorian politics, they wouldn't really disagree with that. They would just say, well, there's so many more factors you have to really tell the story factor in. But so we see that. And some of the, you know, many export producing regions sort of decline or disappear, like tobacco in northwest of Nigeria. I don't know if it's completely disappeared, but it fades out. And the palm oil regions along the Guinean coast, I mean, don't coalesce as a block. And, you know, there was some anomalies. So a lot of what we did in here was try to play this trick of the statisticians and say, well, we have 36 and, you know, it's like 27 of them follow the predictions. So this means there's something there. But, you know, I think there is, I don't think we explain we don't have all the mechanisms, but I think it's very interesting because it generates these hypotheses or it makes you ask these questions. That's another one thing I do like about it. Yes. Yeah, sure. I'll try to give a short answer. Well, that's a really good question. You know, I don't really talk about that here. I think the main point here would be about the territorial jurisdictions. And I think in Sierra Leone, these are also very constant. And so, like the way this kind of analysis would direct attention would be to say, you know, which of these cluster together? Are there voting blocks, or do they cooperate across, or do they have the same, even more generally, same political preferences for the way the national government is run? And when we, to the extent that they are the same as the geographically contiguous units. Is this explained by economic geography? So that's kind of where this sort of analysis would go. But this only focuses on the units. I think the question you asked is a really good one. I think to go down to that level, somebody who was like pursuing this line of reasoning would look at how the economic structure within those units was staying the same or changing, or, indeed part of a change would be if it became much more heterogeneous within the unit than it was, whatever, 50 years ago. That's a good question, though. I mean, the land markets or land trading would we'd expect them to be the most dynamic and the most prosperous agricultural producer regions. I don't know if this is, but so there is a land component of the argument that has to do with national market integration. So what I try to make of that is to say that in those parts of those countries, it's often much more interest in national government policies or indeed local policies that are more conducive to the development of land market than in the lagging regions. But I think, in terms of, I think there's a limitation of this study is that in terms of the economic profile of the units, the territorial units, the emphasis here, this goes back to Adam's question, is kind of, so it's a half empty, half full. So it's on the stability or the stasis side. And it doesn't mean I think there's no change, but the argument is really built on the continuity side of the balance. But thank you for those questions. They're very challenging. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Just curious what you make of the fact that in some countries like the political discourse at the national level very much still influence ethnic and tribal, and you see how that influence and how identify this. So how does that sort of fit in with this?
So it comes up in a couple different ways. So one thing to say is that from an individual, one kind of analysis or individual level, or asking a person like, who did you vote for? And another way to look at the structure of political competition is to look down from above and say, what are the broad spatial patterns? So within one of these regional blocks, we would probably expect that if you so let's say a block is so in Nigeria, we had to use a state level data. It's not constituency, it's admin 1, so 36 states in Nigeria. So within a state, you can imagine that and the state votes strongly for one party, that could be composed to like micro constituencies would be, and within these constituencies, you could have, let's say, this kind of ethnic politics. But why they go in together, why they would cluster with the neighboring state then is sort of, or why they would align, the politicians align the way they do is more the level that this analysis would tap into. But the other thing that is very interesting about ethnicity is one theme that I tried to develop is that the political ethnicities or the ethnic identities that are also political identities form within the territorial grid of the state. So the ethnic and also form around the economic geography or economic, what they might say, vocation or profile of the regions, and the idea of positionality within the national economy. So we are this province, we're a poor province, we have this position within the national economy of a poor province. We identify all, like in Nigeria, as Northerners. It's not even an ethnic identity, or the core northern regions, and that some of the ways that ethnicity is channeled into the national political system or becomes salient in national politics is indeed endogenous to a reflection of the way these identities are shaped by uneven development of the national economy and the territorial grid. So one mini case study there is about the emergence of, back to the Côte d'Ivoire, the Baoulé ethnic identity within Côte d'Ivoire in the 1950s. So the French had a territorial unit called they called it Baoulé unit in Côte d'Ivoire under French colonial rule, but there were no people in there that said, oh yeah, we're all Baoulé. There were different people. So in the 1950s, when the French said, oh, we should have voting now, we're going to start to have voting for a national assembly or regional assembly, the different chiefs within the native authorities within that unit got together and said, we're just going to be wiped out if we can't speak with one voice. So why don't what we should have is a paramount chief of the Baoulé, so that we can all vote together. So they adopt or start to embrace this identity, which is called an ethnic identity, which is actually the name of a territorial unit, so that they can go into the political arena and compete at the national level. So is to say that the ethnic identities somehow are kind of endogenous. I try to emphasize the extent to which it's sort of endogenous to this formation of these political economies, and with this administrative territorial overlay. That's kind of what where I go with that.
Actually, we have another round of applause.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.